We're grateful to have you joining us for today's Fighting Hate from Home webinar, Anti-Israel and Anti-Semitism on Campus. For today's call, ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt will be in conversation with Adam Lehman, President and CEO of Hillel International, Ali Rosenblatt, a recent graduate of the University of Michigan, and Blake Flayton, a student leader at George Washington University. Adam was recently named President and CEO of Hillel International, having previously served as Chief Operating Officer. Prior to Hillel, he served as President of the software and data analytics company Lotame Solutions, and in the same role with the crowdsourced creative platform Genius Rocket. He spent 8 years with America Online, serving as Senior Vice President and Group Chief Operating Officer for the 150-person Central Business Development Unit. Adam is a Dartmouth graduate and holds a JD from Harvard Law School. He was also a Harry S. Truman Scholar. Ali Rosenblatt is a 2019 graduate of the University of Michigan, where she served as Hillel's Community Dialogue Coordinator and as Vice Speaker of the Central Student Government. She currently works as a legislative aide for the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism in Washington, D.C. And Blake Flayton is a student at the George Washington University and a writer on Jewish issues. He has had bylines in the New York Times and Haaretz and is currently a columnist at the Jewish Journal. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the call over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Deb, and hello. Welcome to everyone who is joining us. In the nearly 4 years since I joined ADL, the one question I'm probably most frequently asked whenever I travel, or back here in New York, from lay leaners, from donors, from community members, is they ask me, what's happening on our college campuses and what can be done about it? I hear this from high school students concerned about who are considering applying or enrolling. I hear this from many parents who have children or grandparents who have children there. I hear this from the community leaders who see college campuses as a bit of a battleground. But I think the one group that we don't talk to nearly often enough are the students themselves and the administrators who are fighting on the front lines, trying to maintain the balance. And that's why today's webinar is going to be such a treat. And it's timely because right now colleges and universities are gearing up, whether it's to start holding in-person classes again in the fall or rolling out distance learning opportunities for their far-flung students. So I think it's an appropriate time to delve into this question and think about what will the campus community be like when students, particularly Jewish students, return to campus? Will they continue to encounter anti-Israel, sort of pro-BDS activities? Will they continue to face anti-Semitic incidences, as many did in 2019? How should students, how should campus professionals, how should people who care about what happens in universities, whether it's on the quad or in the classroom, how should they respond when dealing with these and other challenging issues? You know, at ADL, through our campus staff, to our regional offices, and our expert analysts, we've long been engaged in monitoring and countering extreme anti-Israel campaigns and anti-Semitic incidents on campus. Just this week, we released an important new report examining these trends of anti-Israel activity on college campuses, many of which crossed the line from protesting Israeli policies into, if you will, protesting Jewish people. And so we look at the activities that, again, became anti-Semitic in nature, the organizations who are driving it, and I think particularly importantly, the funders who are supporting them. So I'm thrilled today to be to be in dialogue with 3 individuals who each bring a very unique vantage point to what's actually happening on our campuses. And I think they'll be able to respond with insights into how Jewish and pro-Israel students are feeling and how they're responding to the issues. So to get us started, I first want to go to you, Adam, as the CEO and president of Hillel International. Obviously, the last few months, students haven't been physically on campus. But if you look back at the 2019-2020 academic year, from your position and your vantage point at Hillel headquarters in Washington, what challenged students and Hillel professionals the most? And how would you characterize the Uber kind of climate on our campuses?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. I first want to thank you and ADL for including Hillel International in this program. We really appreciate the partnership with ADL and taking on these seriously consequential issues. And I just want to say to everyone listening in, as problematic as these issues are, we're also in the middle of a pandemic, so I hope everyone and their families are staying safe and healthy during this time. In terms of your question, looking back in the past year, as I think many people on the call will know, Hillel is the largest Jewish organization in the world. We're present in 18 countries, 550 campuses. So we do have a very good pulse in terms of the challenges and issues facing Jewish students and these campus communities. And with that question, this increase in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic issues, and anti-Israel incidents has been significant. Through our own tracking on the campuses where we're present, we recorded this past year more than 250 unique incidents that were anti-Semitic or significantly anti-Israel in nature. And even though the year was shortened, that total was actually an increase year over year from the prior year. So, and if you look at anti-Semitism specifically, based on our own tracking, and I know ADL has some really valuable data coming out right now as well, but based on our own tracking, we've seen a fourfold increase over the past several years in these incidents of anti-Semitism. Fortunately, the numbers are still small enough. They're not affecting every Jewish student or even every campus, but they're troubling and significant at the same time. A second challenge that we're seeing relates to mental health and wellness. And this is not unique to the Jewish community on campus. This is facing this generation of students. And even as we and our 1,000 professionals try to address those challenges of depression, anxiety, and other issues more broadly to make sure students can be well and have their Jewish experience from a place of wellness, it seems to me that the issues of alienation, isolation, and bias that Jewish students are unfortunately experiencing on a lot of campuses are only aggravating those issues as well. So that at least gives a snapshot of what we're seeing.
Very helpful. And yeah, to your point about the data, we recently released, not to report this week, about anti-Israel activity on campus. 2 weeks back, we released our 2019 audit of anti-Semitic incidents. So we track them all over the country, both small micro incidents that might not get the attention of law enforcement and crimes, like the 5 people who were killed in assaults on Jewish institutions, to a synagogue, a kosher market, and a private home in the past year. And I think it's profoundly troubling, and I'm not surprised at the issues. That was the highest year we've ever seen in 40 years of doing it. Very problematic. I want to go to you next, Ali, as a recent alumni from the University of Michigan, because you were there in Ann Arbor when there were a lot of controversies. A BDS resolution, that professor, and then the TA who wouldn't give recommendations to students who wanted to study abroad in Israel, the US government's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. So tell us, what was your experience like as a student leader? And now that you've left campus, I'd like to understand, what do you think we should know about what it's like to be, how challenging is it to be a student, a Jewish student, an engaged Jewish student at this time on campuses? Is it exaggerated? Is it really problematic? Talk to us a little bit about that.
So thank you, Jonathan, for that question. And thank you for starting out highlighting the students on the panel. I think that is important to always put forth students in this conversation. And I'll start out by saying that, this is coming from my own experience, and I can't speak for all students. I can't even speak for all students from the University of Michigan. But as you mentioned, there were many different incidents, and you're asking whether or not it seems exaggerated. And you did mention, this is one of the first questions you get asked when you're on the road. And I think that's very telling that to some extent, it is very hyper focused in the media and from outside organizations on this particular issue, when there are so many other issues related to anti-Semitism, within the world at large and on campus. You know, there were white supremacist inspired racist flyers on my campus. There were emails, and there was that nature of anti-Semitism on campus as well. And we're not talking about that enough. So I think it's important to listen to students' voices first in these conversations before coming in with an outside organizational lens. So that was something that made it a little difficult on campus when there were situations, was when there was outside media that almost made the incidents go viral, and then us as students having to answer to that. So that was a first challenge. In terms of the incidents themselves that happened, the administration was quick to respond when there was incidents, and you mentioned the letters of recommendation. The news really paid attention to the initial withholding of a letter of recommendation, but there wasn't as much attention paid to the resolution of that, which was sanctioning of the TA and the professor there. So I think that's important to highlight as well. And also just in having this conversation, I think Adam brings up a good point about thinking about how we can care for the mental health of students on campus. I think making sure we're highlighting the good things that are happening on campus is important for that as well, so as not to fearmonger or scare students from coming to campus, because there's a lot of great Jewish life happening on campus. I wrote about this myself last year when I felt that people were falsely labeling my campus. I said the title was "Don't Falsely Label UM," because I felt like there was so much attention paid to these negative instances. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's helpful to hear. I mean, I've had parents say to me before, literally, Allie, is it safe for my child to go to Michigan? Or is it safe for my child to go to Stanford? Or is it safe for my child to go to, I don't know, Duke? And to each of them, I say, what are you, crazy? Of course it's safe. And we do need to recognize that a raucous campus with debates about issues, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's a very healthy thing. And yet the challenge becomes when that leads from being focused on the kind of issues in a principled way to focus on ideology in a rigid way, which brings us, I think, to Blake. Blake, you know, I follow you on Twitter, and you are a frequent voice on, I think, what I call progressive issues, almost with what some might call an intersectional lens. And it seems like those who really engage in intersectionality in a very zealous sort of way don't want you speaking for them. Help us understand that intersectionality debate. And again, like Ali said, I know you can't speak for all college students, but as someone who's enrolled today at GW, how does the intersectionality debate play out for you as a progressive pro-Israel Jewish student? And what do you think the audience needs to know to understand, you know, the consequences?
Of course. And first I wanted to say that I agree that something that we should not be taking away from this discussion is that, you know, college campuses are in crisis in regards to anti-Semitism and in regards to anti-Jewish sentiments. I think we should keep that in mind, and that actually was spelled out in the report, that it is safe for Jewish students. There is vibrant Jewish life on college campuses. There are Hillels. There is Jewish spaces on our college campuses. In regards to that question specifically, it is a really important question because it's just really important and it needs to be addressed. And the intersectionality movement is a good thing. It is a really good thing. It is something, for those of you who are not aware of that terminology, that encourages diversity, that encourages inclusion, and that encourages really amplifying the voices of those who have been traditionally marginalized from spaces where activism and advocacy happens. The only problem that seems to be arising as more organizations on college campuses and universities adopt these kind of intersectionalist attitudes is that the Jewish people, and specifically Jewish Zionists, so Jewish students who feel either an emotional, religious, political, spiritual connection to the state of Israel are often not welcome in those spaces anymore, because our identification as proud Zionists, supporters of Jewish peoplehood, is seen as an infringement on other people's safety and other people's comfort in these spaces. And that's where a lot of times things on campus run into trouble, where you have proud Jewish students who, might be extraordinarily critical of Israeli policy and what is happening in regards to Israel-Palestine, who are being really marginalized and left out of groups and organizations and campus initiatives because of their identity as Jewish people. And that's a really, really kind of ominous trend that I believe, and as the ADL maps out in their audit yesterday, I think is getting worse, and I think we really do need to address it.
So for you, Blake, to follow up, and maybe Ali, I'd invite you too. So did you see specific examples where, again, progressive Jewish Zionists or Jews found themselves in a situation where it wasn't protesting the Jewish state, but it was protesting their participation as Jews? Like, can you paint a more specific picture for us to make sense of that?
Yes. So this actually happened when we were off campus. We were already in social isolation away from campus. And multiple organizations at GW, I believe this was in early April, made a point to release a document that basically said Zionism is racism, Zionism is Western chauvinism, and called on very specific organizations to not cooperate with Zionists and Zionist organizations on campus as a means to not normalize it. So a lot of Jewish students, including myself, spoke at a student association meeting after that letter was adopted, after that statement was adopted by multiple organizations. And by the way, it was later deleted after multiple Jewish students made our voices heard. But the reason why it was so distressing is because that kind of, decree and saying that we're not going to cooperate with Zionist organizations or students who are sympathetic to Zionism, i.e. Hillel, i.e. J Street, i.e. most Jewish students on campus, it felt hurtful because that has really nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That has really nothing to do with what's going on in regards to that region of the world and what goes on in regards to settlement building and all of that. It really just was about antagonizing Jewish students and making them feel less welcome and less safe in spaces that a lot of us want to be a part of. An organization such as one that advocates for climate change awareness and activism regarding climate change and a Green New Deal. If I were to show up to that organization meeting with a pin on that said, I love Israel, would I be kicked out? Would I be, marginalized? Would I be ignored? And so that happens. I've heard stories, and I can offer more examples of a lot of organizations on college campuses where Jewish students, even before they even say their opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are made to feel uncomfortable.
Ali, do you have similar stories or a different point of view?
Yeah, so on one hand, there was a very similar incident on my campus when Richard Spencer tried to come speak at the University of Michigan. There was a Stop Spencer movement. This was a coalition of diverse student groups working together to stop this known neo-Nazi anti-Semite from speaking on our campus. The Jewish group they worked with, though, was not Hillel. They only wanted to work with JVP. So they didn't want to work with Hillel as a quote-unquote Zionist institution. And we saw continued almost erasure of anti-Semitism with the Stop Spencer movement as well. He is a known anti-Semite. He is very known to hate Jews. Meanwhile, when the student government, a representative put forward a resolution about all the reasons we as a student government should oppose him, they listed, he's racist, he's Islamophobic. They listed all these phobias and isms, and they didn't include anti-Semitism. And we made it known as Jewish students, this can't keep going on, that you're erasing the fact that there is anti-Semitism in this as well. So that was one key incident that I saw that happen. And then on the other hand, I do think that some of this is a self-imposed fear of, well, maybe I can't show up if I'm a Zionist because I've been told that, whether or not it's the organizations telling you that, or you've heard it from maybe a talk like this. So I think it's important to also name that. I had a really impactful training when Yavila McCoy came to my campus and talked a lot about, regardless of issues around Israel and the difficulties of organizing across lines of difference there, you can still show up as an individual, and a lot of times I found that when I showed up as an individual, not wearing my Hillel hat, I was welcome for the most part. I didn't have a sign on my head that said Zionist, and I was still there as a Jew and as someone who would identify as such. So I think there's also that dynamic that does play out as well, that maybe some of it is self-imposed as well. This whole notion of, do I have to check my Zionism at the door, is kind of a fear that some people carry.
Yeah, thank you for that. I find that so unbelievable and very problematic. I will say JVP certainly exists, but to say that it's representative of the Jewish community is just a fraud and factually untrue. And I would encourage people who want to learn more about why that is the case. Look at the report that ADL released literally yesterday on JVP and the issues they're having on college campuses. They are the thinnest of minorities, thinnest of thin reeds on which to stand. But it's painful to hear your story, Ali and Blake. And Adam, I gotta say, like, this criticism of Hillel seems so misplaced. And it's interesting because I know that, Hillel welcomes all Jews of all shapes and sizes and religious practices and political beliefs. So tell me how Hillel deals with this as an institution. And I'd be curious to know how Hillel, and I know you've got different Hillels all over the country, obviously, but do you have relationships at the top or local level with different organizations that actually work with or represent different, communities of color or marginalized groups?
Yeah, great questions. And, I just want to echo, hearing Ali and Blake talk about their personal situations is really frustrating. And unfortunately, it is emblematic of what so many other students are encountering. In terms of how Hillel deals with this, first and foremost, we take the lead when it comes to combating these issues. That's got to be the starting point. And I know we can talk more about how to deal with when anti-Semitism or anti-Israel activity occurs. That is our stock and trade. We don't, trust me, as Ali said before, most, thank God, of what we do on campus is much more about inspiring and building community and building across communities and doing tzedek and social justice and all sorts of other things that represent who we are as a Jewish people and Jewish community. But when we are faced with these challenges, we take it on very forcefully. How do we take it on? We actually do invest heavily in building relationships across campus. And so we've got a Center for Community Outreach, which is the later iteration of a program that was called the David Project, where we are campus by campus actually building partnerships with Black student organizations and Latino student organizations and LGBTQ and all sorts of other groups on campus, because it is critical that the Jewish community is in relationship with other communities, that we understand their challenges and that they understand what we're dealing with. And to your point, Jonathan, we do actually have relationships at a national level, but candidly, it's so much more powerful at a Michigan, a GW, or you name the campus, if those are person-to-person relationships. So that's one of the ways. We also, on more than 100 campuses through a partnership with Maccabee Task Force, bring non-Jewish student leaders with Jewish student leaders to Israel. That's actually very powerful as well, because for so many people, they are working through ridiculous filters. So if you actually give them an understanding of what's happening in Israel, including in the West Bank, which is where those trips go, they can form their own opinions and they come back with a much more nuanced understanding and really a way to relate positively to the Jewish community. And then, of course, we're working with local law enforcement, with administrations, we're actually now really ramping up our training of administrators, because it's so critical that university presidents, provosts, and other senior administrators actually understand what's going on here. It sometimes can be stultifying that they're not necessarily seeing the double standards and the demonization that's happening. But if we can educate and help them learn best practice around how to deal with the issues. And then finally, you started the question pointing out we are inclusive, we are welcoming. By the way, we not only welcome every Jewish student, regardless of political views, religious views, or otherwise, we welcome every student. We actually have 20, 30% non-Jewish student participation in our Shabbat dinners, in our tzedek and volunteerism activities, in so many other activities. So that's what we stand for. And I think all of us just need to continue to make sure that the Jewish communities on campus are the thriving reality that fortunately they remain to be, even with this troubling rise in anti-Semitism.
Adam, thank you for that. I just want to kind of pull together and just say, to your point about Jewish students having political differences, so do Jewish people in general, right? And I know at ADL, we're very vocal advocates for a two-state solution. And we believe you need safety and security for Israelis, but also dignity and equality for Palestinians. That's what we believe. And if you like that, great. If you don't, that's fine. But I think we understand that, particularly in our modern context today, when you say that you don't believe in the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, when you say that Jewish people don't deserve a homeland, you don't have to agree with the policies of any particular political administration in Israel. But when you equate Zionism with racism, when you bring kind of signage and slogans and rhetoric at a time when Jews are experiencing more hate crimes than at any point in the past 40 years, and you demonize and you denigrate them and their institutions like Hillel, that's anti-Semitism. We wouldn't tolerate it if it happened to African-American students. We wouldn't tolerate it if it happened to Muslim students, and we shouldn't tolerate it if it happens to Jewish students. That's why we say clearly, consistently, and unequivocally, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, period. Deb, I think there are a lot of interesting questions I see in the chat. Do we want to kind of open it up a little bit?
Absolutely, and you're right. There are an impressive number of questions today. I'm going to try and group together some of these questions into some broader themes so that we can cover as much ground as possible. And the first question, Jonathan, I'll direct to you, at least to start, that picks up on your last points, which was talking specifically about the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and where those two things cross. And this person specifically asked, do the panelists think it's possible to be critical of Israel's policies and treatment of Palestinians and not be considered anti-Semitic?
So I'm going to take the first shot at that and then open it up. Great. If you're interested in checking out an organization that I think manages to be critical of Israeli policy, not anti-Semitic, if you want an example of one, I'm going to send you to a website. Write this down, www.adl.org. Start there.
Sorry, one more time.
That would be adl.org.
Okay.
There is nothing wrong with protesting policies of the Israeli government. There's nothing wrong with protesting policies of the American government. Just because I don't like the way that this administration has put refugee and immigrant children in cages doesn't mean I'm anti-American. Just because I don't agree with the way the prior administration negotiated a deal with Iran to give it a pathway to a nuclear weapon doesn't mean I'm anti-American. And there's nothing wrong with criticizing policy of the Israeli government, and you can do it in a way that's anti-Semitic. But again, when you equate Israelis to Nazis, when you suggest that Zionism and only Zionism as a form of nationalism has no place in the 21st century, when you deny Jews the rights we would afford to all other people, by the way, often including Palestinians, that's discrimination against Jews. That's anti-Semitism, period. And whether it's by design, by intent, or by implication, whether you understand that or not. Again, we see white supremacists using anti-Zionist rhetoric. We saw Black Hebrew Israelites kill in cold blood several people in New Jersey City using anti-Zionist rhetoric. So whether you're white supremacists or you're radical from the left, the outcome can still be the same. It victimizes and makes Jews vulnerable, and that we won't tolerate, period.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Do any of our other panelists have something they'd like to add there?
I'd like to jump in here.
Sally?
I think What Jonathan said is very important. It's very doable to criticize the Israeli government for any variety of policies. I was on my campus when the embassy was moved, which Jonathan mentioned, and there were protests and events around that specific policy move. Again, that it also involved the US government. So I saw in there like a specific policy that was being targeted rather than the state writ large. And just to even draw out maybe an analogy that I saw on campus was that on one hand, we saw that there was being pro-Palestinian in and of itself is not anti-Israel. Being pro-Palestinian is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. Just as much as being pro-Israel and for the Jewish state is not in and of itself Islamophobic or xenophobic. However, there were times when people crossed the line from criticizing Israel into anti-Semitism, and there were times when people crossed the line from defending Israel into Islamophobia. So that was something that I saw on both sides of this, and I think that is a way that was helpful to point out to people, especially on campus, how we could draw a line. And just to touch upon why it's so important to draw that line, to say that not all pro-Palestinian advocacy is anti-Semitic and not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, so that when it is anti-Semitic, it does carry meaning. It's so important to draw that line because otherwise we won't be taken seriously when it does cross that line.
Those are some great points, Ali. Thank you. So the next question, we've had multiple questions about BDS on campus, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. I wonder, Blake, maybe you can start us off, if you can speak to the prevalence of that on your campus, and Ali, maybe you can then respond. And then I'd love to hear from Adam and maybe Jonathan about the larger trends that you're hearing about or that have appeared in the reports that we're seeing. So Blake, why don't we start with you?
So I view the BDS movement on campus as not really something political, but rather really something psychological. It is I hold the view that if an organization feels that, Israel is committing alleged atrocities against the Palestinian people, healthy criticism and strong criticism of those policies are necessary, and political means to address those concerns are necessary. However, that's not what the BDS movement does. Especially, that's not what the BDS movement does on campus. The BDS operates with the 3 Ds that the ADL provides in reference to when anti-Zionism crosses the line into anti-Semitism. And those are delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. And this is all going to be, packaged in the language of BDS and the language of this discussion. BDS delegitimizes, Israel as a settler colonial state whose only purpose is to impose white supremacy against the Palestinian people. And there it is a delegitimate state, is it a delegitimate entity, and therefore any manifestations of Israeli culture and Israeli society are therefore also illegitimate. So Israeli people, Hebrew, and then in the case of BDS, Israeli scholarship and Israeli academia. And so then what happens is you have discrimination against Israeli scholarship at colleges and universities, something that really doesn't have anything to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And some people, in the Judaic Studies department might benefit a lot from Israeli scholarship and academic work. So that's the delegitimization campaign then turns anti-Semitic because now we're discriminating against Jewish people and Israelis simply because they either are citizens or feel an attachment to the Jewish state. And then demonization. The BDS movement constantly propagates that, well, if Israel is a white supremacist, evil apartheid state, then anybody who associates themselves with it must be a white supremacist, apartheid, genocide enabler, and all of the things that they have associated with the Jewish state. So therefore that demonizes Jewish students, Jewish Zionist students on campus who might do something just as simple as attending a Friday night service at Hillel. there are a number of students, there are a number of anti-Israel activist students across the country who are now demonizing Hillel and demonizing Shabbat services on campus. My friend and I, my friend told me a story about how one time she brought home challah from a Hillel dinner, and one of her friends said, "Oh, I can't eat that, I'm pro-Palestinian." So these are just, that's delegitimization, and that's demonization. From my own experience, demonization is, students at the George Washington University accusing people who had attended APAC, even students such as myself who don't really see them ideologically aligning perfectly with APAC, let's just say, but went to go hear speakers and went to learn and listen to panels. There were many GW students who started a lie that we were starting a plague, that we had spread the coronavirus on campus, because there were reports that there was potential exposure at the APAC conference. And then later that day, as I was leaving a Shabbat service with a kippah on, I was, shouted at on the street with calls of, "You produced it, you started it, you created it," and another derogatory word for Jewish person. And then, of course, the double standards that we talked about at the University of Michigan in regards to the letter of recommendation, the double standards in regards to how all other countries and how all other, not only other countries, but how all other minority groups on campus are treated and respected. There seems to be a double standard when it comes to Jewish students, especially those who are in support of Israel. These are all things that the BDS movement encourages, and that the BDS movement supports, and that the BDS movement advocates and wants to see spread on college campuses. And it really, none of this has really anything to do with how Israel treats Palestinians, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the geopolitics of that region. And it really has everything to do with marginalizing Jewish voices on campus, vilifying Jewish voices on campus. And if they do complain, or if they do, take issue and bring it to a student association or a professor or a thing, or an administrator, a lot of times it is delegitimized, because Zionism itself, by means of the BDS campaign, has been demonized and delegitimized.
Blake, I have to say that is some of the most cohesive and impressive commentary on BDS that I've heard from anyone, like some of the greatest scholars included. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Ali, is there anything you'd like to add? And it's perfectly okay to not.
Blake packaged it so nicely. So I would just add that I think he characterizes, Blake characterizes the BDS movement correctly. I would just add that, from conversations with people that were, promoting the BDS-like resolution on my campus, and people in student government and others who ascribe to this view on my campus, a lot of, it's very much packaged as, this is how you fight Israeli oppression, and this is how you fight for Palestinian rights. There's a very big disconnect between what we know about some of the ways in which the movement has been anti-Semitic and the people that are a part of it on campus. So the majority of the people I met promoting this movement didn't know the history of its anti-Semitic ties and the notions there. And a lot of conversations around that were very productive when you come to the conversation with people on campus without assuming they have anti-Semitic intentions. So that was something that I found really important in conversations, is that yes, some of the impact was anti-Semitism, and also they weren't doing this out of a desire to target Jews. So it's a very difficult dynamic there. So I would just add that.
Can I follow up by any chance?
Please do.
So that is a really great point, Ali. And I think it's really important to understand that there are the vast majority of students on college campuses who might consider themselves to be anti-Israel or anti-Zionism do not engage in anti-Semitism and do not engage in attacks against Jewish people and Jewish students on campus. The problem is, there's two problems that we need to address in this situation, in that often the people who are leading these organizations, who are at the forefront of anti-Zionist activism on campus, and pro-BDS activism, they present their ideology and they present their their work and their activism work as social justice and as the underdogs fighting against, oppressors, David fighting against Goliath, and things and social justice and progressivism and things that we all want to agree with, especially on college campuses, in my generation. We were brought up with believing in equal rights and equal opportunity and that kind of thing. And that is how the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, pro-BDS argument is being framed. So a lot of students who do consider themselves progressives and do consider themselves wanting to be activists for equal rights think to themselves, even if they don't know, especially if they don't know anything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Zionism, and maybe they've never even met a Jewish student before in their life, they think to themselves, well, if I agree with these people on A through Y, then I must agree with them on Z too. And I must believe that the Jewish people who object to this, who object to these circumstances on college campus, they're doing it because of some right-wing conspiracy, or they're doing it because they have an agenda and they're not acting in good faith, and we're the ones who are standing up for social justice. So I think going forward, it's really important that we frame this movement as no, attacking Jews on campus and marginalizing Zionist voices and vilifying those who feel connection to Israel is counterproductive rather than productive. It's regressive rather than progressive, and it's definitely illiberal rather than liberal, because it makes people feel disrespected because of who they are as Jews. And what is that if not anti-Semitism?
Yeah, exactly. It brings in anti-Jewish bias. And the thing I think we have to remember is that these are not isolated campaigns on a given campus. This is a well-funded, internationally coordinated and organized set of campaigns that, unfortunately have both the intent and ultimately the effect of, creating isolation, alienation, double standards, and harassment for Jewish students and Jewish communities. It is as troubling as it sounds in the ways that Ali and Blake are describing it. And unfortunately, it turns out to be very manipulative, as they're saying. There are lots of students and others who get caught up under a fundamental misimpression of what the campaign is about, who stands behind the campaign, and what its ultimate goals are. I will add to that, though, that there is the only good news, and then I'll follow with some bad news. The good news is that when we look, and we do holistically, and combat BDS, around the world, really, on campuses, there has been a flattening in the number of campaigns on individual campuses. Some of that, I think, is that there's so much futility ultimately, because thank God administrations are mature enough and understanding enough in the end not to actually effectuate a boycott, divestment, or sanction. And some of that is that there are great Jewish student leaders who are working really hard to help their campuses understand the fuller picture here. The bad news is it's not, even as we've seen a decrease in, or at least a flattening in the number of formal BDS campaigns, we've seen an overall increase in the number of anti-Israel events and activities. So it's just morphing, which is why we all need to continue to be aggressive in taking it on.
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add here, Deb. I would simply say, again, there's nothing wrong with protesting policies. There's something profoundly wrong with discriminating against people. I can't eat your challah. I won't go to your universalist institution like Hillel. And relegating people to second-class status. This is the definition of discrimination. It's unconscionable, and it should be unacceptable to administrators and people of good faith everywhere. But Deb, it does make me think of something I'd like to ask. I mean, Blake and Ali, or Adam, again, what you've seen across campuses, can you give some examples of situations where you felt that you were able to, at the individual or the campus or the enterprise level, push back effectively on delegitimization? And what is your recommendation to the student enrolling on campus, to the parent with the kid on campus? Like, how do you, or to someone like me as a Jewish communal executive, how can we be helpful to fight this? Specifically, what do you think has worked, and what should we be doing?
So Jonathan, I'm actually going to build on that, because what you're talking about is reflected very strongly in a lot of the questions we're getting, which really focuses on what kind of advice would you give to students who are starting college and about to enter a campus life, And what kind of advice would you also give to the student administrators when it comes to confronting these things? And then the biggest piece of the puzzle is the action. How can people take action, and at what levels can they do that? And what are some tactics that you found that worked or that you would think would be good ideas to help address these things? Blake, you want to start?
Sure.
All right.
I would say that just kind of framing this with the first point. What's really happening on a lot of college campuses is students, they were born up in these, they were raised in these proud Jewish households, and they attended these, JCCs, and they were bar mitzvahed, and maybe they went on birthright, and they were, they've been to Israel many times, they have family in Israel, and yet they still consider themselves very, very proud, strong progressives. And then what happens is when they come to school, and by the way, I'm speaking generally about, the anti-Zionist rhetoric, coming from these spaces. And I understand that white, nationalism and racism, and the Richard Spencer example is definitely also a threat. But what happens is a lot of Jews give up on a part of their identity because they see it's not worth fighting for. Maybe they've been wrong. Maybe they're the ones who are biased. And, when I was a proud Zionist student and I showed up to an organization, and one of the first things that was said in this organization was, Zionism in this club will not be normalized, and Zionism is a transnational project that should not be normalized or given validity, which the transnational project in and of itself is an anti-Semitic trope. And what a lot of Jewish students do is accept that. And in order to be accepted into these social spaces, and in order to, appear, quote unquote woke about this issue, they will denounce their Zionist identity, and they will denounce, their sense of attachment to a Jewish peoplehood, and make the argument and make the discussion political, rather than the way they were raised, which was, part of their identity. And so I just say to my advice to Jewish students coming in is, don't feel pressured to change part of yourself based on what another student tells you, or if another student makes you feel bad, or if another student makes you feel left out, or if an organization says something or does something at a rally or at a protest or at, or at a meeting that makes you feel confused and hurt, instinctively hurt, question it and stand up for yourself. Because we can't afford more Jewish students who just, pretend that the issue doesn't exist on college campuses, and just pretend that the issue is not existing outside their door, outside their dorm room door. And then in regards to what we can do to remedy it, I would just say that we really have to change the narrative. And the narrative right now, which is quite successful, but if I do say so myself, is that the Zionist Jewish students are the quote unquote oppressors. They are silencing free speech on campus. They are, attacking students who are pro-Palestinian. They're marginalizing voices, even Jewish voices, who are critical of the Israeli government. And while there are extreme cases where, things like that could be true, Jewish students need to flip the narrative by saying, no, we are being discriminated against. We deserve to have a space on this campus. I can be a strong advocate for a Green New Deal and a strong advocate for a two-state solution, one of them being Jewish. And I just think that we need to change the conversation, because people want to play the victim mentality, and that's just not the way that we're going to go through this. We need confidence in your identity as Jewish students, unwilling to change based on whatever anybody else says.
Thank you, Blake. Allie?
Yeah, I would add to what Blake started out saying, if you're trying to join a club on some other progressive issue, and this is coming up, and back to my earlier point, like, you can still stay as an individual. Nobody's going to ask you to out yourself, whether or not you're a Zionist or not, if you're talking about the Green New Deal or something else. And I think if you don't stay in that space, it's just gonna become a cyclical issue of people feeling less comfortable if they are a Zionist, or if they are Jewish and might be inclined to be a Zionist. And then there won't be anybody like that in the room anymore. So I think it's important to stay in the room and stay in the conversation. And when the time comes, you can bring it up. But if we're not in the room, that's never going to happen. I think if you really truly care about both these issues, you need to stay in those rooms. You know, back to the Richard Spencer example, a few of us in one of my sociology classes, we had participated in one of the Stop Spencer walkouts during a week of action. And at the rally, as they're talking about why this Nazi shouldn't come to campus, they're saying, oh yeah, and by the way, it's really great that we passed this BDS resolution on campus. I didn't walk away when they said that, because at the end of the day, I don't want a Nazi coming to my campus. So I think it's so important to stay in those spaces if you truly care about these issues. And we can't let this rhetoric around normalization, around you can't be a Zionist here, deter us from caring about those other issues, because then we're doing a disservice to ourselves and the values that we hold so dearly as Jews who care about tzedek and justice. And then on another point, just to maybe push back on something that Blake brought up, is that this rhetoric around marginalizing students, or back to something that Adam had brought up about making Hillel an inclusive space for students, or it being an inclusive space for students. I think we need to make sure it is an inclusive space and assure for students of varying views on Israel as well. You know, I had the opportunity to participate in many different dialogues within my Hillel building, where we were allowed to, you know, disagree on what our opinions were on X, Y, and Z policy, and we were still welcome in that space. And we need to make sure that our Hillels are welcoming to Jews across the spectrum of opinions on Israel, because if we can't talk there, then we are perpetuating that narrative around students not being able to voice their opinion freely, and it just adds to this narrative around Hillel. So we need to make sure that groups like groups that do people that are part of groups that might have disagreement or might have their own personal disagreement are able to express that freely in Jewish spaces as well.
Can I just follow up on something Ali said real quick?
Sure, a quick one.
Yeah, I would just say 100% I agree with that. And that if we as Jewish Zionist students are, you know, demanding inclusion in spaces as we should, then we also need to level the playing field and make sure that, you know, our spaces and that our spaces of dialogue are just as open and just as accepting to all ranges of opinion, or else we're doing nothing but contributing to the division on campus.
Thank you for that, both of you. Adam, maybe you can speak to this a little bit too. You know, maybe what's your wish list as CEO of the largest Jewish students on campus organization? What would you want to see happen from, you know, college administrators and faculty?
Yeah, well, I mean, they answered that, but also the questions you had aggregated before. That we know that, because we do see this across the entire ecosystem, the biggest antidote and the most powerful way we can all take on anti-Semitism and really more virulent anti-Israel activity is by supporting strong Jewish life on campus, so that Jewish students have a place to be in community, so they feel supported, so someone has their back when issues come up, and so they have a platform from which to work. So it sounds self-serving, but if people support, you know, Hillels on campus or other ways that they want to invest to support strong and thriving Jewish student life, that's huge. And part of that is not self-segregating. Jonathan referred to it earlier on. It's crazy for families to look at articles and say, oh my God, well, there was an anti-Israel, you know, event at this campus. Now we can't send our kid there. No way. We don't want to self-segregate. We want Jewish student communities that are thriving and strong everywhere that they can be. And back to not self-segregating, as Ali said, we need to be in relationship to other communities on campus, so that they understand us, we understand them. And then finally, to your point with administrators, we really do need administrators to take these issues seriously, to have backbone, and to get over their sense of, oh my God, you know, I can't, you know, because I'm going to alienate this person or that person. They need to recognize anti-Semitism is a real issue. It's a problematic issue. It is on par with other issues, and they need to take action. Now it's on us, and we're doing it to educate them so they understand both what they're dealing with and then how to actually take those steps. And you would ask initially about examples. I will give a shout out to President Bollinger at Columbia University, a university that has been thrown under the bus a lot because there has been a stream of BDS campaigns and anti-Semitic activities. Before the pandemic, he had given a speech to the Student Senate and then written it up, strongly opposing not only BDS, but explaining the way that the campaign was creating an uncomfortable and even unsafe campus climate. So when university leaders are willing to be principled, willing to speak out, it really goes a long way to creating the kinds of campus climates that we want for all students, including Jewish students.
Thank you for that, all of you. Those were fantastic and really complete answers. I want to be mindful of time, and we are almost out of it. I have to say, like, this is some of the most active I've seen the chat with questions, and we've gotten to some, but really it is the tip of the iceberg. This is obviously a very rich issue that touches a lot of people very close to home. But I would very much like to thank all of you for participating with us today. And Ali, Blake, I hope I'm as articulate as the two of you are when I grow up. Both of you, incredibly impressive. I can't thank you enough for being with us today and sharing your views. I know that those are personal, and we're really grateful for that. And Adam, good luck to you. I think you're off to a great start, and Hillel clearly has great things coming up. So thank you all very much. Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
When you see anti-Semitism on campus anywhere else, number one, speak up. Flag a post on Facebook, say something in the meeting. Don't shrink from using your voice. Number two, stick to the facts. Let the anti-Semites, let the racists resort to say awful, ridiculous, hysterical things. Stick to the facts, be level-headed and data-driven. And finally, show strength. Again, campus administrators, university trustees, those of you who are donors, use your strength and don't hesitate to pick up the phone, open up your email, organize, and speak out. That's the only way we'll stop this.
Thank you. Great points all around. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and thanks everyone who's with us today on the phone. I hope you continue to stay healthy and safe, and I hope that we'll see you back in our next Fighting Hate from Home, which will be on June 11th as we move to an every other week pattern instead of every week. Be well. For those of you celebrating, a happy Shavuot, a Chag Shavuot Sameach, and be well until next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, and Chag Sameach.
Thank you, everyone.